Picture this: a village square alive with laughter, the scent of roasting meat mingling with wood smoke, the rhythmic stomp of dancing feet shaking the earth beneath them. This wasn't just a party, it was the lifeblood of medieval communities, a sacred thread weaving neighbors together in a tapestry of shared joy. Today, we're stepping into a world where festivals weren't mere events, but the very glue of society, where entire towns paused to celebrate traditions so powerful they could mend feuds, forge alliances, and even legend has it ward off disasters. Across Europe, from the misty hills of Scotland to the sun-drenched vineyards of Italy, people once marked the turning of the seasons, the blessings of harvests, and the mysteries of faith with celebrations so vibrant, their echoes still whisper to us centuries later. But here's the twist: most of these festivals have vanished from memory, erased by time, politics, or the slow march of progress. Yet their legacy lingers in unexpected places, maybe in the maypole dances of your childhood, the bonfires of midsummer, or even the quirky local fairs that feel oddly timeless. This video is your invitation to uncover 21 of these forgotten medieval festivals, each a window into a world where community wasn't just a word but a living, breathing force. We'll witness masked processions that blurred the lines between human and spirit, feasts where social hierarchies crumbled under the weight of shared merriment, and rituals so potent they could turn strangers into family for a night. Why does this matter now in our fast-paced, screen-dominated age? Because these festivals remind us of something primal, the irreplaceable magic of coming together. In a time when loneliness is called an epidemic, these ancient traditions whisper a bold truth: celebration isn't frivolous, it's survival. So light a candle, pour yourself a drink, and let's journey back to an era where joy was a collective art form. By the end, you might just find yourself longing for the day when your own town square could erupt in unfiltered, unapologetic revelry. No smartphones, no algorithms, just human connection, raw and radiant. The bonfires are lit, the story begins. To understand these vanished festivals, we have to step into the rhythm of medieval life, a world where survival depended on the land's generosity and the heavens' mercy. Imagine a time before electric lights, before factories, before the very idea of weekends. The year wasn't marked by deadlines or vacations, but by the slow turn of seasons, each one dictating when to plant, when to harvest, when to feast. These festivals weren't just breaks from work, they were sacred punctuation in a life of relentless toil, moments when the entire village could exhale together. At the heart of it all was the agricultural calendar, a dance with nature that left no room for error. A failed harvest meant starvation, so communities developed rituals to plead with, thank, or even trick the forces that governed their survival. In spring, they danced to wake the earth from winter's slumber. In autumn, they lit bonfires to celebrate the grain that would carry them through the cold. Even the church, with its rigid feast days, couldn't fully erase older traditions. Instead, saints' days often overlapped with pagan rites, creating a tapestry of belief where faith and folklore intertwined. But these gatherings did more than mark time. They were social alchemy, transforming strangers into kin. In an era when most people never traveled more than a few miles from home, festivals were rare chances to meet outsiders, arrange marriages, or settle disputes under the neutral banner of celebration. For a day or a week, hierarchies softened. The wealthy might share tables with peasants, masters with servants, all bound by the unspoken rule that revelry leveled the playing field. There's evidence that some festivals even included role reversals, servants acting as lords, children as judges, a temporary upheaval that, paradoxically, reinforced the social order by letting steam escape. What's haunting is how little we truly know. Many of these traditions were never written down, passed instead through songs, dances, and whispered stories. By the time scholars thought to record them, industrialization had already begun erasing communal rural life. What survives often comes from church condemnations or court records, accounts of rowdy celebrations deemed too pagan or too chaotic. Yet these fragments hint at something extraordinary, a world where joy was collective, where the entire village bore witness to life's milestones, where even grief was shared aloud under open skies. That's why these forgotten festivals matter. They remind us that before clocks and calendars ruled our lives, humans measured time in sunrises and storytelling, in the kind of togetherness that didn't need an invitation, just a shared understanding that sometimes the most vital work isn't labor at all, but the act of raising your voice in song alongside your neighbors as the firelight flickers against the coming dark. Few spectacles in medieval Europe could match the sheer audacity of the Feast of Fools, a whirlwind of laughter and rebellion where the world turned upside down. For one delirious day each winter, usually around December 28th, cathedrals and town squares became stages for a glorious charade. Lowly clerics dressed as bishops delivered mock sermons full of bawdy jokes. Peasants crowned themselves kings while actual nobles played the fool, their authority dissolved in the chaos of collective glee. Even donkeys were led into churches, their braying mingling with hymns as congregants deliberately sang off-key, reveling in sacred spaces suddenly alive with irreverence. This wasn't mere mischief, it was a carefully choreographed pressure valve. Medieval life was rigid, with every person locked into their place by birth, duty, and faith. The Feast of Fools acknowledged that tension by granting permission to mock the very structures that held society together. Records describe abbots of Misrule leading parades through streets, tossing rotten fruit at spectators, while costumed revelers acted out skits lampooning greedy merchants or pompous lords. The rules were simple, nothing was sacred, and no one was spared. Yet beneath the raucous surface lay a profound truth. By allowing this controlled explosion of dissent, communities actually strengthened the social order. After all, it's harder to resent a system when you've had the catharsis of laughing at it. The church's relationship with the festival was complicated. Early on, many clergy tolerated it, even participated. Some saw it as a medieval version of comedy relieves tension, like a safety net for collective frustration. But by the 1400s, as religious reform movements gained steam, the Feast of Fools became a target. Bishops wrote furious edicts condemning the diabolical revels, horrified by the sight of altar boys wearing mitres backward or drunkards dancing on communion tables. The irony, many of the festival's elements, masks, role reversal, satirical plays, were ancient traditions long predating Christianity. The church hadn't erased paganism, it had absorbed it, and now the old spirit of rebellion was bubbling back up. Yet the Feast of Fools never truly died. Its DNA lives on in places you might not expect. Think of modern carnivals like Mardi Gras, where masks erase social status for a day. Or April Fool's Day, when pranks remind us how delicious it feels to upend expectations. Even political cartoons and late-night satire owe a debt to those medieval jesters who proved humor could be both weapon and balm. What's remarkable is how these communities understood something we often forget: that laughter, especially when directed at power, isn't just entertainment. It's a survival tool, a way to breathe freely in a world of heavy crowns and heavier expectations. The Feast of Fools whispered a radical idea: Sometimes the healthiest thing a society can do is pause, put on a jester's hat, and let the donkey preach the sermon. Now imagine the first warm breeze of spring rustling through a medieval village fields awakening, flowers pushing through thawed earth, and in the center of it all, a towering maypole crowned with ribbons fluttering like a living rainbow. May Day wasn't just a celebration. It was a collective sigh of relief after winter's grip, a riot of color and movement where entire communities rejoiced in nature's rebirth. At dawn, young men would race into the woods to cut down the tallest birch or maple they could find, dragging it back to the village square amid cheers. The friendly rivalry between towns to erect the most impressive pole was fierce. Some reached dizzying heights, their tops hidden by clouds of blossoms and greenery. But the real magic began when the dancing started. Villagers, dressed in their finest, would each take a ribbon, young women holding white for purity, red for passion, green for growth, and weave intricate patterns around the pole as music swirled through the air. This wasn't just entertainment. Every twist and turn held meaning. The braiding of ribbons symbolized the intertwining of lives, the cyclical nature of seasons, and yes, the fertile union of earth and sky. For unmarried youths, it was a rare chance to brush hands with a sweetheart under the watchful but approving eyes of the community. Courtship here wasn't hidden. It was celebrated as naturally as the budding trees. Then there was the Green Man, a mysterious figure clad head to toe in leaves, his face sometimes carved into wooden masks with vines sprouting from his mouth. He'd emerge from the forest leading a procession, his presence a whisper of ancient pagan beliefs lingering beneath the Christian surface. Some saw him as a spirit of the wildwood, others as a symbol of the earth's endless renewal. Wherever he walked, laughter and a touch of unease followed, as if the boundary between human and nature briefly blurred. Puritans, of course, despised it all. To them, the maypole's phallic shape and the uninhibited dancing reeked of paganism and sin. In the 1600s, they outlawed May Day celebrations in England and the American colonies, chopping down poles and fining revelers. But you can't kill a tradition this deeply rooted. Like wildflowers breaking through cobblestones, May Day survived disguised as Garland Day in some villages, reborn in schoolyard dances with paper streamers. Today, traces linger in the flower crowns of music festivals, the May Queens crowned at county fairs, even the simple act of hanging a wreath on your door. What makes May Day endure isn't just its beauty, but its honesty. In a world increasingly disconnected from the land, it reminds us that we're part of something older than calendars, a dance as ancient as the first spring, where every step, every ribbon, every breath of petals on the wind whispers, the earth remembers even when we forget. Barely a week into the new year, when frost still clung to the furrows and the earth slept beneath its frozen blanket, villages across England erupted in a spectacle that would make any modern parade look tame. This was Plow Monday, the day farmers dragged their most sacred tool from winter storage and turned work into worship. Picture the scene, a procession of plows, polished until they gleamed, decked with ribbons and evergreen boughs, hauled through muddy lanes by teams of oxen or men wearing garlands like living statues of the land itself. Behind them came the plow boys, faces smeared with soot, rattling collection boxes and singing rhymes older than the church steeples they passed. A refusal to donate that might earn you a symbolic plowing of your doorstep, a cheeky reminder that no one escaped their ties to the soil. At the heart of it all burned the plow lights, candles flickering on church altars, their wax drippings carefully saved to anoint the first seeds sown come spring. This wasn't just superstition, it was agricultural insurance in an age when a bad harvest meant hunger. The church, ever pragmatic, had woven older pagan rites into its calendar, blessing the plow as fervently as any relic. In some villages, a full plow would lead the way, a makeshift contraption dragged by revelers in animal masks, their antics echoing ancient rituals to startle winter into retreat. For one day, the rigid lines between sacred and profane blurred as farmers became priests of the earth, their tools transformed into objects of reverence. Yet Plow Monday's true power lay in its demands for collective effort. Before mechanization, plowing required neighbors to pool oxen, share labor, and time their work to the rhythms of the open field system. The festival reinforced this interdependence. Wealthy landowners were expected to fund the feast, while poorer families received food and coins, ensuring everyone entered the planting season on equal footing. Records from Lincolnshire describe tables groaning with plough pudding, a suet-wrapped monstrosity meant to fuel a day of dancing and drinking. Even children had roles carrying miniature ploughs door to door, their innocence a charm against blight. Then came the steam engine. As enclosed fields replaced communal farms and factories drew laborers from the land, Plow Monday withered. By the 1800s, many saw it as a quaint relic, its rituals fading like frost in the sun. But traces linger. In parts of East Anglia, you might still find Morris dancers blackening their faces in homage to the soot-smeared ploughboys, or village pubs serving plough buns on the old date. Modern farm shows often feature vintage plough processions, though few realize they're reenacting a rite that once bound entire communities to the land and to each other. What's haunting is how this festival reveals the cost of progress. Plow Monday didn't just mark a calendar, it sustained a worldview where humans saw themselves as partners with nature, not conquerors. The candles, the songs, the shared feast, all whispered a truth we're relearning today. Survival has always been a team sport. When the last plow light sputtered out in some forgotten chapel, more than a tradition died. A way of living rooted, reciprocal, resilient faded with it, leaving us to wonder what else we've sacrificed at the altar of efficiency. In the hush of midwinter, when daylight was scarce and the year's burdens felt heaviest, medieval cathedrals witnessed something extraordinary, a child ascending the bishop's throne. The boy bishop's revelry, celebrated most often on December 6th or 28th, wasn't just charming theater, it was a sacred rebellion. Choir boys, some as young as 7, traded their cassocks for miniature mitres, leading processions with solemnity one moment and giggling mischief the next. Congregations adored it. For a few fleeting days, the solemn echoes of Latin hymns mingled with the sound of children's laughter bouncing off vaulted ceilings, as the boy bishop delivered sermons that balanced piety with playful jabs at his elders. Records from Salisbury Cathedral describe a boy bishop parodying the bishop's mannerisms, his high voice echoing through the nave as he pretended to scold clergy for napping during services. In York, the chosen child carried a gilded staff, blessing crowds who pressed coins into his hands, donations that funded feasts for the choir school. The inversion went beyond symbolism. These boys held real, if temporary, authority. They could demand hospitality from local gentry, pardon minor offenses, even lead prayers for the town's welfare. For communities where children were often seen, not heard, this festival whispered a radical truth. Wisdom and joy weren't the sole domain of adults. The Church's tolerance for this tradition reveals a medieval world more nuanced than we imagine. Initially, the boy bishop's revelry may have emerged from the Feast of the Holy Innocents, a day commemorating Herod's victims. But like so many medieval festivals, it absorbed older currents, perhaps echoes of pagan solstice rites where youth symbolized renewal. Bishops justified it as a lesson in humility for clergy, a reminder that spiritual leadership required childlike wonder as much as erudition. Yet by the 1500s, reformers saw only heresy. To Protestants, the spectacle smacked of Catholic excess. To counter-Reformation Catholics, it seemed undignified. By the 1700s, the boy bishop had vanished from most of Europe, his mitres gathering dust in sacristy chests, yet the spirit refused to die. In Spain, the tradition of El Obispillo persists in Burgos, where a choir boy still processes through the city on St. Nicholas Day. In Provence, children dress as bishops during the Fête des Innocents, tossing sweets to crowds. Even modern Christmas pageants, with their star-topped shepherds and earnest narrators, owe a faint debt to those medieval boys who proved leadership could wear a child's face. What's poignant is how this festival reveals medieval communities' comfort with paradox, solemnity and silliness, hierarchy and upheaval, all held in balance. The boy bishop wasn't just entertainment, he was a living metaphor. In a world of plague and hardship, his brief reign reminded villagers that renewal often comes in small packages, that joy could be found even in the darkest month, and that sometimes the best way to honor sacred order was to turn it playfully upside down. As the sun dipped below the horizon on June 23rd, villages across medieval Europe erupted in a blaze of light, not from torches, but from towering bonfires that turned night into day. St. John's Eve was no ordinary celebration. It was a symphony of fire, faith, and folk magic, where entire communities gathered to dance, leap, and plead with forces beyond their understanding. These weren't just fires, they were beacons against darkness, fueled by herbs like St. John's wort, plucked at twilight when their protective powers were said to peak. Young lovers clasped hands and vaulted over flames, their daring jumps believed to seal marriages or guarantee fertile fields. Elders tossed bundles of foxglove and vervain into the embers, their smoke curling into the warm air like prayers made visible. The roots of this night ran deeper than Christianity. Long before churches renamed it for John the Baptist, pagans had lit midsummer fires to honor the sun at its zenith, begging it not to abandon them as days began shortening. The Church, ever pragmatic, grafted these rituals onto St. John's feast day, turning solstice into sacrament. In Sweden, they called it Midsommarafton, decorating maypoles with wildflowers. In Spain, La Noche de San Juan saw coastal towns flinging effigies of witches into the flames. Ireland's hilltop fires glowed like constellations, while in Germany, glowing wheels rolled downhill, symbolizing the sun's descent. Everywhere, water held magic too. Morning dew gathered on St. John's Day was said to heal ailments, and maidens floated flower garlands on rivers to divine their futures. What's fascinating is how these fires became social glue. Wealthy landowners supplied the wood, peasants arranged the kindling, and children collected the herbs, a collaboration that blurred class lines. After the flames faded, ashes were scattered over crops as blessed fertilizer, and charred sticks became talismans nailed above doorways. Even the church participated, with priests blessing bonfires in some regions, acknowledging the people's need for tangible rituals. Industrialization dimmed the tradition, but its sparks still fly. Denmark's Sankt Hans Afton bonfires crown beaches with effigies of witches. Latvia's Ajani celebration sees revelers wearing oak leaf crowns, singing ancient songs until dawn. Modern witches still gather herbs this night, and in Newfoundland, Johnny Walkers carry torches through towns, ghostly echoes of medieval processions. St. John's Eve reveals a universal truth. Fire doesn't just destroy, it transforms. Across centuries, these flames have been both plea and promise, a way for fragile humans to stand shoulder to shoulder against the dark, whispering, "We are still here and we are not afraid." Christmas morning in Tudor England dawned with an unlikely ruler holding court. Not a king or bishop, but a commoner draped in makeshift robes, his scepter a sausage, his crown woven from holly. This was the Lord of Misrule, elected to govern 12 days of sanctioned anarchy where the world flipped on its head. From manor houses to Oxford colleges, his reign transformed staid halls into theatres of the absurd. Servants sat at the head table, tossing bones to their masters crouching on straw below. Kitchen staff organized elaborate treasure hunts leading nobles through pigsties, while the Lord himself decreed outrageous penalties. A duke might be sentenced to recite love poetry to a milkmaid, or a bishop forced to drink ale from a shoe. The genius of this chaos was its precision. Far from mere debauchery, the Lord's rule followed ancient scripts. His court often included a mock chaplain preaching nonsense sermons, a treasurer demanding kisses as currency, and jesters parodying local dignitaries. Records from the Inner Temple in London describe law students building elaborate floats, dragons spouting wine, giant pies concealing naked acrobats that paraded through streets lined with roaring crowds. Yet beneath the laughter lay ironclad rules: no actual violence, no permanent disrespect, and crucially, everything reset when Epiphany arrived. Like a theatrical performance, the disorder had a curtain call. Puritans saw only sin. To them, the Lord of Misrule embodied everything vile about popish excess. His crown a blasphemy, his games devilish distractions. When they seized power in the 1600s, they outlawed the tradition with puritanical fervor, replacing wassail bowls with sermon books, but the spirit proved unkillable. Traces linger in the British pantomime's gender-bending dames, in the ugly sweater rebellion of corporate holiday parties, even in the universal glee of watching bosses humiliated in annual talent shows. What fascinates isn't just the festival's audacity, but its psychological wisdom. Medieval communities understood that rigidity breeds fracture. By carving out sacred space for rebellion, timed, ritualized collective, they let steam escape the kettle before it could explode. The Lord of Misrule wasn't just a clown, he was a social alchemist turning the leaden weight of hierarchy into the gold of shared laughter. His greatest trick. Making people believe just for 12 days that the world could be remade and returning them, refreshed to the old order when the candles guttered out. As December's final hours slipped away in medieval Scotland, villagers braced not for quiet reflection, but for a night of roaring fires, disguised faces, and a sacred anxiety: who would be first to cross the threshold after midnight. This was Hogmanay, a New Year's celebration so steeped in mysticism, it made modern fireworks look tame. At its heart lay first footing, a ritual where the year's luck hinged on the stranger who darkened your door. Picture this: a knock echoes through the frozen dark. You open it to find a neighbor, ideally tall, dark-haired, and male, bearing gifts like coal for warmth, salt for preservation, or whiskey to toast the unknown. His arrival wasn't just friendly, it was cosmic insurance, a charm against famine and misfortune woven into the very fabric of community survival. But before first footing came saining, a purification right older than the kirk's stone walls. At dawn, women moved through homes with smoldering juniper branches, its sacred smoke curling into corners to drive out lingering spirits of the old year. Next came water from a dead and living ford, a stream where the living stepped over the dead, sprinkled on floors and faces alike. These weren't superstitions, they were acts of alchemy, turning houses into vessels for new beginnings. The boundary between sacred and mundane dissolved as even farm animals received blessings, their hides brushed with evergreen boughs to ensure fertile flocks come spring. What made Hogmanay extraordinary was its controlled chaos. Guising the ancestor of Halloween costumes saw villagers donning hides or straw masks to embody hooded horses or old wives, their disguises allowing mischief without consequence. In Shetland, the Up Helly Our Fire festival sent Viking longships blazing into harbors, while Orkney's Bargame turned entire towns into rugby-like battlegrounds where rival factions fought for a leather ball until dawn. This wasn't just revelry, it was communal catharsis, a way to collectively shed the year's burdens through sweat and laughter. Then came the slow fade. Industrialization scattered tight-knit villages to cities, where tenement stairwells couldn't accommodate torchlit processions. Victorian moralists recast Hogmanay as a quaint custom, stripping its raw vitality for parlor games. Even the church chipped away, replacing juniper smoke with perfunctory prayers. Yet in places like Stonehaven, where fireballs still swing on chains through midnight streets, or Burghead's burning the Clavey, where a tar-barrel bonfire crowns an ancient Pictish fort, the old magic flickers on. Modern Edinburgh may host the world's largest New Year's party, but its staged concerts lack the intimacy of a Hebridean Croft's whispered seining, where the line between ritual and survival once blurred entirely. Hogmanay's legacy whispers a challenge to our disconnected age. Can luck truly be found in algorithms and resolutions, or does it still hide in the hands of a neighbor bearing bread, in the scent of juniper purging last year's ghosts, in the reckless joy of strangers becoming keepers of one another's fortunes? The answer might just lie in the embers of those forgotten fires, waiting for someone, perhaps you, to carry them across the threshold again. On a steep hillside in medieval England, as Whitsun church bells faded into the distance, an entire village held its breath, then sent a 7-pound wheel of double Gloucester cheese careening down the slope, with a dozen grown men tumbling wildly after it. This wasn't a drunken stumble or a bizarre accident. It was the cheese rolling of Whitsun, a festival where gravity, dairy, and sheer audacity collided in a spectacle that blurred the line between sport and sacrifice. The rules were simple yet brutal: catch the cheese if you could, and claim both the prize and bragging rights for a year. Broken bones, just part of the fun. Beneath the laughter lay layers of ancient meaning. Cheese itself was sacred, a concentrated form of milk, symbolizing the land's fertility. Rolling it downhill mirrored the sun's descent, a plea for abundance as crops reached their peak. Some scholars argue the event marked old boundary rituals, where the cheese's path reinforced parish limits in an era before maps, and the hill, likely a site of older pagan gatherings, its slope a natural amphitheater for communal recklessness. What better way to honor the earth's generosity than by hurling its riches down a cliffside, trusting the same soil to cushion your fall? The festival thrived precisely because it defied sense. Unlike solemn processions or scripted plays, cheese rolling was pure, unfiltered chaos, a rare moment when medieval life's rigid order gave way to glorious unpredictability. Records from the 1500s describe bakers and blacksmiths alike shedding their tools to join the chase, their wives cheering from the sidelines with baskets of ale and bread. Even local priests reportedly blessed the cheese before its descent, a wink to older gods beneath Christian veneer. Industrialization nearly ground the tradition to dust. By the 1800s, newspapers clucked over barbaric injuries, and authorities cited public decency to ban the event in most villages. But like so many medieval festivals, its spirit proved indestructible. Modern Gloucester's cheese rolling, now a global internet sensation, keeps the madness alive, though with ambulance crews on stand-by and participants signing waivers. The cheese still wins every time, of course. No human can outpace a wheel accelerating to 70 miles per hour. Yet thousands still gather, drawn by the same primal thrill that animated their ancestors. The chance to briefly outrun gravity, decorum, and perhaps even time itself. What endures isn't just the absurdity, but the unspoken pact between cheese and chaser. In a world obsessed with safety and control, this festival whispers a subversive truth. Sometimes joy lives where risk still dances freely, where a split-second decision to leap after a bouncing dairy product becomes a rebellion against the mundane. The hill remembers what we've forgotten, that celebration isn't always pretty, polite, or even safe, but it's always unmistakably alive. Dawn barely cracks over the frost-laced hedgerows when the hunt begins, not for deer or fox, but for the tiniest of creatures, the wren, a bird no heavier than 2 coins stacked together. Across Ireland and Wales, groups of boys once crept through brambles on St. Stephen's Day, their pockets stuffed with stones, their mission grim yet sacred. To catch the king of birds was no child's game. It was a ritual older than the churches whose bells would soon toll for the feast. The wren, they whispered, had betrayed Irish soldiers with its chirping, or led the Magi to Bethlehem, versions blurred like ink in rain, but the outcome never wavered. The bird must die, yet this was no mindless cruelty. The wren's sacrifice pulsed with ancient logic. In pagan Europe, small creatures often symbolized the spirit of vegetation, their death and resurrection mirroring the cycle of crops. The wren, despite its size, carried outsized myth. Druids supposedly divined omens from its flight, and Celts linked its piercing song to otherworldly messages. By the Middle Ages, the Church had threaded new meaning onto old rites, calling the hunt a punishment for the wren's crimes. But the timing, December 26th, when the New Year's shadow loomed, betrayed its deeper roots. This was magic disguised as morality, a way to harness the bird's vitality for the coming spring. What happened next transformed tragedy into theater. The boys would stitch the wren's tiny body onto a holly branch, or, in kinder times, substitute a fake bird, then parade it through the village atop a pole decorated with ribbons. At each door they sang the wren song, a melody both jaunty and eerie, demanding coins to bury the wren. Households paid eagerly, refusing risked a hex or, at the very least, a year of bad luck. The collected money funded a raucous feast where the same children who'd hunted the wren now celebrated its symbolic resurrection through music and dance. Even in death, the bird bound the community together, its sacrifice buying not just food but a shared story. The songs outlived the hunt. Folk musicians still perform, the wren boys reel, its minor key evoking the paradox at the festival's heart. Joy threaded with sorrow, reverence laced with violence. In County Kerry, a few villages keep a sanitized version alive, children carrying feather-adorned boxes instead of carcasses. But the ritual's near disappearance speaks to a broader unraveling. As Europe modernized, such customs were dismissed as backward or barbaric, their complex symbology flattened into simplistic brutality. What's lost when a wren isn't hunted? Not just a relic of superstition, but a portal to a world view where humans and nature were locked in sacred negotiation, where even the smallest life held power enough to shape a community's fate. The wren's song still echoes in those old melodies, a reminder that our ancestors knew something we've forgotten, that survival sometimes requires rituals that unsettle us, that gratitude and grief can share the same feast table, and that the king of birds, though tiny, once ruled the longest night of the year. On the coldest night of midwinter, when the apple trees stood like skeletons in the moonlight, villagers across England did something that would baffle modern farmers. They sang to them. Not polite carols, but rowdy, ale-fueled chants, clattering pots and pans to wake the slumbering trees from their frosty sleep. This was wassailing, a ritual where agriculture and revelry collided in a single, sacred purpose, to scare off evil spirits and guarantee next autumn's harvest. Picture the scene, a procession of farmers carrying lanterns through snow-dusted orchards, their breath visible in the icy air as they circled the oldest tree, the apple tree king. A jug of cider, often spiked with toast soaked in alcohol, was poured over its gnarled roots like an offering to some ancient deity. Then came the noise, guns fired into branches, children banging sticks, and everyone roaring the same words that had echoed through those orchards for centuries. Stand fast, root. Bear well, top, pray God send us a good howling crop. But wassailing wasn't confined to orchards. As night deepened, the same villagers would split into bands of house wassailers, trudging door to door with wooden bowls of spiced ale. At each threshold, they'd sing until the household paid them in food, drink, or coins, an early form of trick or treating with a boozy twist. The wealthy were expected to be especially generous. Refusing the wassailers risked a curse on their livestock or a brick through their window come morning. In return, the singers bestowed blessings, their verses weaving together Christian piety and older incantations. Come, butler, come fill us a bowl / or else we'll break your door and scroll / we are not daily beggars / we are your neighbors. What's striking is how these two traditions, orchard and house wassailing, reflected medieval England's delicate dance between faith and folklore. The cider poured on roots likely harked back to pagan libations for fertility spirits, while the house visits mirrored Christian charity during the 12 days of Christmas. Even the word wassail came from the Old English wes heel, meaning be healthy, a toast that became a ritual, then a demand, then finally a fading memory as Puritan reformers condemned the practice as drunken paganism. Yet in Somerset and Herefordshire, where cider runs thicker than blood, wassailing never fully died. Modern versions see families tying toast to branches, a nod to the spirits, food, and soaking roots with cider so potent it might actually make the trees tipsy. The songs, passed down through generations, still carry that mix of threat and tenderness unique to rural survival, a reminder that our ancestors knew something we've forgotten. Prosperity wasn't just earned through labor, but negotiated through ritual, through noise, through standing shoulder to shoulder in the dark and daring the frost to take what's yours. The apples, like the community that cherished them, needed more than sunlight and soil to thrive. They needed to be seen, celebrated, and above all sung awake. Deep in the Staffordshire countryside, as September's first Monday dawns, 12 men shoulder an unlikely burden, reindeer antlers, bleached by time and polished by generations of hands. This is the Abbot's Bromley horn dance, a spectacle so ancient, its origins dissolve into the mist of prehistory. The horns themselves are the real marvel, 6 pairs, carbon dated to around 1060, making them older than the Norman conquest. Each set weighs nearly 25 pounds, their curves blackened by centuries of sweat and candle smoke, carried through the village by dancers whose footsteps trace the same paths their ancestors walked before the Domesday Book was inked. The dance unfolds with hypnotic strangeness. The antler bearers move in 2 lines, accompanied by a fool in rags, a hobby horse snapping its wooden jaws, and a musician squeezing melodies from a concertina that replaced much older instruments. They weave through the village for 10 miles, stopping at farms and pubs where the horns are offered for touching, a gesture believed to transfer their primal power to crops and livestock. There's no record of when it began, only that it's never stopped, surviving Reformation purges, Civil War battles, and the Industrial Revolution's relentless march. Scholars still spar over its meaning. Some see a prehistoric hunting ritual fossilized into folk custom, where dancers reenact the chase of stag and hunter. Others argue it's tied to medieval forest rights, a symbolic claim to the privilege of hunting in Needwood Forest, once royal land. The hobby horse, with its snapping jaws, might represent the forest's wildness tamed, while the Maid Marian character added in Tudor times shows how the dance absorbed new layers like a living palimpsest. What's undeniable is its grip on the modern imagination. Today, thousands gather to witness this relic of communal memory, some sensing echoes of shamanic rites in the antlers' sway. The dancers, all locals, guard their roles fiercely. Some families have participated for generations, their names etched in parish records alongside those who danced during the Black Death or the Blitz. In a world of disposable trends, the horn dance is a defiant thread of continuity, stitching together centuries with every measured step. When the last note fades and the antlers are returned to the church until next year, something lingers beyond the spectacle. The uncanny sense that these dancers are neither performers nor reenactors, but conduits. They remind us that celebration can be more than entertainment. It can be a covenant with the past, a whispered promise that some threads, no matter how frayed, will never snap. In the heart of medieval France, as Christmas approached, cathedrals echoed not with solemn hymns but with the raucous braying of donkeys, a sound both absurd and sacred. This was the Feast of the Ass, a celebration so delightfully bizarre, it blurred the line between devotion and satire. At its center stood a young girl, often the most innocent in the village, perched atop a donkey decked with ribbons, processing down the nave as clergy and congregation sang hymns to the donkey. Not just any donkey, mind you, this was the honorary descendant of the very beast that carried Mary to Bethlehem, now elevated to near sainthood for one gloriously irreverent day. The liturgy itself was a masterpiece of medieval humor. Imagine chanting verses like, "Hail, brother ass," or listening to a sermon extolling the donkey's virtues over humankind's folly. In Sens Cathedral, records describe a choir boy imitating the animal's cries between Latin verses, while in Beauvais, the prose of the ass featured lyrics praising its holy bray. For communities living under the church's rigid hierarchy, this was more than comic relief. It was a fleeting inversion where the lowliest creature became king, and sacred rituals could laugh at themselves. But why a donkey? Beyond the nativity story, the animal symbolized humility and service qualities the church preached but rarely practiced. By honoring it, villagers subtly celebrated their own unsung labor. The girl astride the donkey mirrored Mary's purity, yes, but also represented every peasant child whose worth went unnoticed. Even the braying hymns, seemingly sacrilegious, echoed older pagan traditions where animal noises warded off evil spirits. The church had long absorbed such customs, but by the late Middle Ages, reformers grew uneasy. What began as holy folly started looking like heresy. The crackdown came swiftly. Bishops condemned the feast as a beastly mockery, banning donkey processions by the 1500s, yet its spirit refused to die. In Provence, creche scenes still feature exaggeratedly stubborn donkeys nudging the Christ child. Spanish nativity plays include La Burra, a comic donkey character who steals scenes from the wise men. Even our modern image of a grumpy donkey at the manger owes a debt to those medieval revelers who understood a profound truth. Sometimes holiness wears a shaggy coat and brays in the face of pomp. The Feast of the Ass reveals a medieval world far more complex than we imagine, one where faith and laughter weren't enemies but allies, where a humble animal could bridge the gap between the divine and the everyday. When the last donkey left the cathedral, it took with it something irreplaceable, the permission to find joy in the sacred, and perhaps to see the sacred in the joyfully absurd. Along the windswept coasts of medieval England and Normandy, December 6th dawned with children scavenging the shoreline not for fish or driftwood, but for treasures far smaller: seashells, polished stones, bits of colored glass worn smooth by the tides. These weren't playthings but sacred building materials for Grotto Day, a festival where the young transformed humble finds into miniature shrines honoring St. Nicholas, the patron saint of children. Picture a village square dotted with these tiny marvels, oyster shells arranged into archways, pebbled pathways leading to candlelit alcoves where a wooden saint statue stood guard over offerings of dried fruit or honey cakes. Knock on a grotto's door, often a scallop shell on a hinge, recite a rhyme praising the saint, and you might earn a treat, a precursor to trick or treating with a salty, maritime twist. The magic lay in its alchemy of piety and play. St. Nicholas' legend as a gift giver had seeped into coastal communities through sailors' tales, how he'd secretly tossed gold coins through a poor family's window, saving their daughters from destitution. By building grottos, children weren't just mimicking the caves where the saint was said to take refuge. They were creating portals between their world and his benevolence. The shells themselves held power limpets for protection, cowries symbolizing wealth, whelks spiraling like the paths of fate. In some villages, mothers tucked barley grains into the grottos, hoping the saint would bless next year's harvest as he'd once blessed those gold coins. What's striking is how the tradition wove survival into celebration. Fishing communities, whose lives depended on the sea's whims, saw St. Nicholas as both spiritual guardian and a kindred spirit, a fellow wanderer of perilous waters. The grottos, temporary as sandcastles, mirrored their own fragile existence. Yet for one day, children held the power to summon abundance from scarcity, turning flotsam into sacred art. Even the treats reflected the sea's economy: dried herring, ship's biscuits, or in wealthier ports, oranges imported from the Mediterranean, their exotic scent mingling with brine. By the 1800s, Grotto Day had largely vanished, eclipsed by Christmas trees and stockings hung by the chimney, yet its fingerprints linger. The Dutch Sinterklaas tradition, where children leave shoes out for gifts, echoes the grotto's exchange of rhymes for rewards. In some Cornish villages, December still sees shell-adorned lanterns glowing in windows, ghostly cousins of those candlelit shrines. Even the modern obsession with shell crafts owes a debt to those medieval children who first saw sacred geometry in a mussel's curve. The grottos whisper a truth we've forgotten. Generosity wasn't always about store-bought presents under a tree. Once it was a handful of walnuts given in exchange for a song, a saint's kindness remembered in the crunch of a child's teeth on a honeyed almond, the understanding that the best gifts aren't just received, they're built syllable by syllable, shell by shell, from whatever the tide washes up. Shears glinted in the June sunlight as the last fleece tumbled onto the growing pile, its lanolin-rich fibers still warm from the sheep's back. This wasn't just work, it was the cue for one of rural England's most raucous celebrations, the sheep-shearing feast. Across the Cotswolds, the Yorkshire Dales, and down to Devon's rolling hills, villagers transformed shearers' calloused hands into badges of honor, their blistering labor repaid with tables groaning under roast mutton, ale by the barrel, and sweet curd tarts made from the season's first milk. The air hummed with competition, two men wrestling on fresh-cut hay, their grips strengthened by lanolin, while women raced to card wool faster than their neighbors could spin it into golden thread. Balladeers perched on ale stools sang "The Black Sheep," its mournful tune belying the laughter as children chased each other through piles of fleece like living clouds. This was more than a party, it was an economic sacrament. Wool wasn't just England's biggest export by the 1400s, it was the literal fabric of society, funding cathedrals and wars alike. The finest fleeces, known as Leicester ore for their metallic sheen, fetched prices that made them worth their weight in silver. At the feast's height, even lords and abbots would join the revelry, their presence acknowledging the shearer's alchemy, turning living coats into liquid wealth. The menu itself told the story: mutton from cold ewes, cheese pressed from morning milk, and shearer's cake, a dense barley loaf studded with raisins to fuel the next day's work. Every bite was a reminder that full bellies and full purses depended on those aching backs bent over bleating flocks. What set this festival apart was its intimate tie between labor and reward. Unlike harvests where nature dictated timing, shearing was human-paced, a skill so valued. Master shearers traveled circuits like rock stars, their arrival sparking bidding wars between farms. The feast wasn't just gratitude, it was retention strategy. A Lincolnshire ledger from 1523 lists 8 gallons of ale per shearer, not as payment, but as bonus. The message was clear: work hard and the community will lift you. Then came the machines. The first mechanical shears in the 1800s didn't just cut wool, they severed the ritual's heartbeat. No longer did villagers gather to marvel at a champion's blade work or cheer as children raced with ribbons woven from fresh fleece. Wool became commodity, not ceremony, its magic reduced to bales stamped with factory marks. A few nostalgic estates revived the feast in Victorian times, but its soul had faded like watching actors play at a harvest they'd never sowed, yet echoes persist. In the Welsh borders, some farms still host shearing suppers, where old ballads are sung between electric clippers buzz. The Cotswold Olympics keep the wrestling alive, though few competitors reek of lanolin now. What's lost isn't just tradition, but the visceral understanding that celebration grows best when rooted in shared effort. That there's no sweeter cider than the kind passed to you by hands still sticky with the day's work. The sheep-shearing feast whispers a question we've yet to answer. When we uncoupled joy from labor, what else did we leave behind in the shearing shed? On the first Monday of May in Helston, Cornwall, the cobbled streets explode with color as hundreds of dancers weave through the town, not to music but to the insistent peal of the town bell. This is the Furry dance, a living fossil of medieval merriment where every step, every garland, every flower-strewn hat whispers of older magic. The name itself is a puzzle. Some say Furry comes from the Cornish fur, meaning fair, while others insist it's a corruption of feathery, referring to the dancers' leafy costumes. But the truth might be simpler. This was once the Flora's dance, a pagan rite to honor the goddess of blossoms, later baptized into Christian tradition when the church couldn't stamp it out. What makes this festival extraordinary is its unbroken thread. While most medieval pageants faded into history books, Helston's dance survived Puritan sermons, Victorian prudery, even 2 world wars. The ritual is deceptively orderly: couples in formal dress processing hand in hand, men in tailcoats, women in flowing gowns. But look closer. The Hal Anto, a rockerside show of villagers dressed as St. George, dragons and forest spirits, erupts through the streets like a memory of older chaos. They carry a flowering hawthorn branch, singing verses that mix Cornish legend with Christian allegory. Robin Hood and Little John, they both are gone to the fair, oh. This isn't just performance, it's palimpsest, layers of meaning scraped and rewritten but never fully erased. The flowers tell their own story. Dancers wear bluebells for constancy, primroses for young love, and hawthorn, the fairy tree, for protection. Centuries ago, these weren't decorations but charms, their scents believed to ward off evil spirits lingering from winter. Houses along the route still hang boughs of sycamore and oak, echoing pagan tree worship. Even the dancers' route matters, tracing a sacred boundary around the town, as if marking territory against unseen forces. The church tried to redirect this energy, tying the event to the feast of St. Michael, but the old magic pulses beneath the surface. Modern visitors might see only quaint folklore, but the Furry dance is anything but static. During the miners' strikes of the 1980s, the procession swelled with out-of-work laborers, their flowers woven into pit helmets. In the pandemic, silent dances were held in gardens, the bells' chimes streaming online to a global audience. This adaptability is its secret. Like the hawthorn branch carried through the streets, the tradition bends without breaking. What endures is the dance's alchemy, the way it transforms a fishing town into a stage, strangers into neighbors, and history into something you can twirl through in your Sunday best. When the last note fades and the petals are swept away, Helston doesn't just remember its past. It wears it, breathes it, dances it into the future, one May morning at a time. Dawn breaks over the rolling hills of the Scottish borders, and the rhythmic clatter of hooves echoes through the mist, not from an invading army, but from a procession of townsfolk on horseback, their saddles creaking as they follow ancient trails between weathered boundary stones. This is the riding of the marches, a tradition where civic duty and celebration collide in a spectacle older than the nations it once defended. Picture farmers in their Sunday best alongside local officials, all mounted on horses decked with ribbons, tracing the precise limits of their common land. At each marker, they'd pause, sometimes with a ceremonial tap of a riding crop, other times with a full-throated toast, ensuring no neighboring lord had encroached even an inch onto soil their ancestors had fought to call their own. What began as medieval necessity became theatre with teeth. In an era before GPS or property deeds, borders lived in collective memory, passed down through rituals like these. The riders weren't just checking stones, they were embodying a pact between people and place, where land wasn't owned but stewarded. Records from 16th century Selkirk describe how every able-bodied man under 60 had to join the ride or face fines, proof this was serious business. Yet the day always dissolved into revelry, races between boundary points, feasts where ale flowed as freely as the ballads recounting past rides, and the ceremonial smoking the marches, where boys waved burning torches to purify the route. The message was clear: community wasn't just shared hardship, but shared joy in defending what you loved. The church played its part too, blessing riders with prayers for protection against spiritual and earthly foes. But older magic lingered. In Annan, riders carried a flowering hawthorn branch, a nod to pre-Christian boundary charms, while Howick's procession included a captured flag from an English raid, paraded like a talisman. The line between law and legend blurred. To ride the marches was to stitch history into the land itself, one hoofbeat at a time. Industrialization nearly erased the custom. As maps grew precise and fences regimented, the need for communal border checks faded. But in a handful of towns, Selkirk, Langholm, Berwick, the rides endure, now more pageant than practicality. Modern spectators might see only costumed nostalgia, yet something primal remains. When the Selkirk standard-bearer gallops with the Berg flag, his horse's mane flying, it's not just a reenactment. It's a pulse of memory, a reminder that borders were once living things tended by hands, remembered in songs, defended not just with swords but with shared laughter and the occasional drunken tumble into a hedgerow. The riding of the marches whispers a challenge to our walled-off world. What if we still knew our boundaries by heart, not as lines on screens, but as stories etched into the earth, guarded not by bureaucrats but by neighbors who'd recognize a shifted stone as surely as a missing face at the supper table? The riders may no longer need to patrol for encroaching armies, but their hoof beats still echo the old truth that land is only as secure as the community that cherishes it. In the shadow of the real mayor's grand procession, another parade wound through medieval streets, one where beggars wore tattered robes of office, chimney sweeps brandished broomstick scepters, and the town fool held court from a barrel instead of a throne. This was the mock mayor election, a riotous tradition where the powerless seized the reins of authority, if only for a day. Towns from England to Germany crowned their own, kings of Misrule from society's margins, the homeless, the disabled, even livestock. In Bristol, records describe a Lord of Misgovernance elected from the local leper colony, his coronation followed by a feast where nobles served him on bended knee. In Germany's Narrenfest, fools in grotesque masks passed absurd laws taxing sunlight or decreeing mandatory laughter, while crowds roared approval. The genius of these spectacles lay in their precision. Mock mayors didn't just lampoon authority, they exposed its absurdities through carefully staged inversions. When a beggar fined merchants for their greed or a drunkard sentenced the town priest to a day of silence, the jokes carried sharp truths. These weren't random acts of rebellion but communal pressure valves, allowing criticism under the guise of play. Even the church tolerated it initially, with some French abbeys hosting feasts of fools where choir boys elected a boy bishop to parody their superiors. The message was clear: laugh at power together and you'll resent it less alone. Yet by the 1600s, the laughter grew strained. As religious wars and peasant uprisings swept Europe, elites saw mock elections not as harmless satire but as dangerous sparks. London bandits mock Lord Mayor processions after apprentices used them to stage anti-tax protests. In Nuremberg, authorities replaced the traditional Fool's King with a wooden effigy, a hollow symbol that couldn't speak truth. The tradition didn't die so much as get defanged, its radical edges smoothed into pantomime. Modern echoes persist where you'd least expect. Washington, D. C.S. King Frostival crowns a local celebrity as winter monarch to parody political pomp. Britain's silly season elections like the Haxey Hoods fool still let villagers mock bureaucracy with tongue-in-cheek decrees. Even online culture, with its meme presidents and viral campaigns for fictional candidates, channels that medieval urge to crown the underdog as a mirror to the mighty. What's lost is the raw catharsis of those pre-modern festivals, where a beggar's mock edicts weren't just jokes but communal exorcisms of shared frustration. Today's parody elections entertain. Medieval ones transformed spectators into accomplices, binding them through laughter that was, for one fleeting day, the most powerful law in the land. January 7th dawned cold and loud in medieval villages, not with church bells, but with the clatter of tin cans bouncing off spinning wheels. This was St. Distaff's Day, the unofficial return to work after Christmas revelry, where women resumed their endless textile labor, while men turned obligation into uproarious sport. Picture the scene: spinners settling back into their stools, wool baskets at their feet, only to have their concentration shattered by gangs of young men hurling makeshift percussion rusty cans, dried peas in pots, anything that could rattle, before darting away like schoolboys. The rules were simple. Women could retaliate by dousing the offenders with water, turning workplaces into chaotic battlegrounds where laughter and exasperation tangled like unspun yarn. Beneath the raucous surface lay a fascinating snapshot of gendered labor. Spinning wasn't just women's work, it was the medieval economy's backbone, with households relying on thread production for everything from barter to dowries. St. Distaff's Day acknowledged this drudgery with a peculiar mix of teasing and tribute. Men's antics both mocked and highlighted the relentless nature of women's unseen labor. Some historians argue the cans symbolized the noise of domestic life interrupting holiday peace, while others see a deeper metaphor: the clatter of male frivolity against the quiet, sustaining rhythm of female industry. The holiday's namesake was pure irony. St. Distaff never existed. The day was nicknamed for the tool central to women's work, a wooden rod holding unspun fibers. By playfully sainting the distaff, communities acknowledged its sacred role in daily survival. Even the date carried meaning. January 7th fell just after Epiphany, when the liturgical calendar shifted from celebration to ordinary time. The Tin Can Band wasn't just mischief, it marked this transition, a cacophonous alarm clock for post-holiday reality. What's poignant is how the tradition faded not from disapproval, but obsolescence. By the 1800s, spinning wheels gathered dust as factories churned out cheap thread. The distaff itself became a relic, its name surviving only in idioms like Distaff side for maternal lineage. Modern attempts to revive St. Distaff's Day, often by historical reenactors, miss the original's gritty authenticity. Without the weight of real spinners' calloused fingers or the tension of households balanced on thread production, the tin cans ring hollow, a pantomime of a world we've lost. Yet the day whispers a truth we still grapple with. How often do we celebrate labor only when it stops? The clanging cans honored work by disrupting it, a paradox as tangled as the flax on a distaff. Perhaps we've inherited more than we realize, not the noise, but the need to laugh through the grind, to mark the return to routine with something louder than a sigh. Deep in the snowbound valleys of the Alps, as February's first light crept over the peaks, villagers awoke to a sound both thrilling and terrifying, the bellowing of a bear. Not a real one, of course, but a man swathed in shaggy furs, his face smeared with soot, lumbering through the streets with chains clanking at his ankles. This was the Candlemas bear hunt, a festival where winter itself wore claws and teeth, and driving it out required nothing less than a full-scale mock battle. Picture the scene, villagers armed with pots and pans, their shouts echoing off icy cliffs as they cornered the beast, herding it toward the outskirts where spring might finally take root. The bear, sometimes played by the town's strongest woodcutter or its poorest beggar, would roar and lunge, his performance walking the line between menace and farce, until at last he succumbed, collapsing in the snow as cheers erupted. Then, with ritual solemnity, his pelt was removed, revealing the man beneath, reborn like the land itself. The roots of this spectacle stretch back further than the churches that later claimed it. Before Christianity draped Candlemas over ancient Imbolc celebrations, Celtic tribes revered the bear as a sacred bridge between worlds, its winter hibernation mirroring nature's death and rebirth. In medieval times, the hunt became layered with new meaning. The bear embodied winter's grip, yes, but also the devil's temptations, Lenten sacrifices, even the raw fear lurking in the forest shadows. Some villages staged elaborate trials where the bear confessed its sins before execution, while in the Pyrenees, the animal was resurrected days later, its return symbolizing cyclical time. The chains, a nod to humanity's fragile control over nature's brute force. What's striking is how the ritual mirrored real bear mythology. Alpine hunters once believed bears were born formless and licked into shape by their mothers, a metaphor for winter's chaos yielding to spring's order. By killing the bear, villagers weren't just banishing cold, they were participating in creation itself. Even the date held power. Candlemas, February 2nd, marked the midpoint between solstice and equinox, when daylight finally gained decisive ground. The bear's fur, often stored until sowing season, became a talisman, its earthy scent mixed with seeds to ensure fertility. A few towns still keep the old magic alive. In Switzerland's Valais region, the Candlemas festival sees children in bell-covered costumes driving out winter bears with whips and songs. Slovenia's Kurantovanj features fur-clad figures shaking off evil spirits, their masks echoing the bear's snout. But modernity has tamed much of the bite. Where once the bear's capture involved genuine peril, men diving into frozen rivers to prove their mettle, today's reenactments prioritize safety over symbolism. The chains are lighter, the growls more theatrical, the stakes reduced to photo ops. Yet when the last faux pelt is hung up and the crowds disperse, something lingers, the primal understanding that winter wasn't just weathered, it was wrestled. The Candlemas bear hunt reminds us that our ancestors didn't passively await spring. They staged its arrival, donning the very guise of what they feared to prove they could endure it. In an age of central heating and grocery stores, we've lost the visceral need to chase away the cold. But somewhere beneath the snow, the bear still stirs, waiting for us to remember that survival, at its heart, has always been a kind of theater. High in the Peak District hills, where the air smells of limestone and damp earth, a figure straight out of legend rides through Castleton's cobbled streets every May 29. The Garland King is no ordinary horseman. His entire upper body vanishes beneath a towering, bell-shaped frame woven from fresh flowers, his face obscured by a dense curtain of greenery that sways with every step his patient mare takes. Atop this living sculpture sits a crown of oak leaves, cradling a single blackened branch said to be from the very tree that hid a fugitive king centuries ago. This is Oak Apple Day, a festival where botany and royalty collide in a spectacle so surreal, it feels plucked from a medieval dream. The origins are as tangled as the garland's ivy. Officially, the day commemorates Charles II's narrow escape after the Battle of Worcester in 1651, when he crouched in an oak's hollow while Cromwell's soldiers searched below. By the Restoration, Parliament declared May 29th a national holiday, ordering churches to deck their pulpits with oak boughs, a living rebuke to Puritan austerity. Yet Castleton's version hints at older roots. The King's flower-shrouded anonymity mirrors pre-Christian green man rituals where nature spirits were invoked to bless crops. Even the garland's final act, hoisted by rope to the church tower, where its flowers rain down on cheering crowds, feels less like royal pageantry and more like an offering to the sky itself. What's mesmerizing is how the tradition absorbs contradictions. The Garland King's costume weighs nearly 60 pounds, its frame painstakingly rebuilt each year with thousands of garden blooms and wildflowers, yet the central oak branch remains stubbornly dead, a relic of the past preserved amid living splendor. Locals debate its symbolism. Is it Charles' salvation or an older token of forest worship? The king himself, always a local man, becomes both monarch and sacrificial figure, his identity erased by foliage just as history swallows individual lives. When children pin oak apples to their lapels, a sly reference to the gall wasps that infest the trees, they're threading together ecology, politics, and myth in a single gesture. Puritans hated Oak Apple Day, seeing it as pagan excess masquerading as royalist loyalty. Victorian reformers tried to sanitize it, replacing the garland's wildness with orderly wreaths. Yet Castleton's version endured, its oddness its armor. Today, as the garland sways toward the church spire, tourists snap photos while scholars scribble notes, but the oldest villagers still touch their foreheads when the oak branch passes. They remember the unspoken rule: this isn't just about a king in a tree. It's about the stubbornness of life, the way traditions, like oaks, bend without breaking, and how even the most political symbols can put down roots deeper than anyone intended. The Garland King rides on, petals trailing behind him like whispers of all the meanings this day has carried, and all the secrets it still keeps. The flickering candlelight of Twelfth Night cast long shadows across the banquet tables of medieval Denmark, where goblets of mulled wine sat untouched, not from disinterest, but from a game of delicious tension that turned every sip into a high-stakes secret. This was the silent toast, a holiday tradition where revelers walked the razor's edge between celebration and subterfuge. Before the feast began, a single dried bean or tiny trinket would be hidden in one guest's portion of cake. Whoever found it became the night's secret king or queen, while another, chosen by lot or whispered conspiracy, was designated the fool. The rules were simple yet agonizing. Throughout the meal, attendees could only raise their glasses in silent tribute to these hidden figures. A single stray word, a misplaced chuckle, and the game was lost, revealing identities too soon and spoiling the evening's carefully crafted suspense. What made this ritual extraordinary was its psychological ballet. In an era when holiday gatherings were often loud, raucous affairs, the silent toast demanded the opposite, a performance of perfect restraint. Imagine the scene, nobles biting their lips to suppress smiles as the fool unknowingly dropped breadcrumbs down his tunic, or the secret monarch's widening eyes as someone nearly addressed them by title. The tension wasn't just playful. It was ceremonial, echoing older winter solstice traditions where silence was thought to ward off evil spirits. Danish sagas even mention warriors observing similar quiet during Yule feasts, believing noise might attract the attention of roaming ghosts. By the Middle Ages, the game had evolved into a test of wit and social grace, where the ability to keep secrets mirrored the broader virtues of discretion and loyalty. The Church's relationship with the silent toast was characteristically mixed. Some clergy embraced it as a wholesome alternative to drunken carousing, while others suspected pagan roots in its bean divination and role reversals. Records from Roskilde Cathedral show monks adapting the game for Epiphany celebrations, hiding a carved wooden Christ child in loaves instead of beans, a twist that aligned the ritual with the Magi's search for the newborn king. Yet the heart of the tradition remained unchanged, the thrill of the hunt, the shared complicity of silence, and the final, uproarious reveal when masks dropped and toasts were finally spoken aloud. Victorian sensibilities strangled the custom with velvet gloves, as 19th-century etiquette manuals preached against undignified games and enforced rigid dining protocols. The silent toast's unstructured merriment fell out of favor. The bean became a mere trinket in Christmas puddings, stripped of its power to crown kings or fools. Modern versions survive in fragments: Spanish roscon de reyes cakes with hidden figurines, or the Norwegian tradition of hiding almonds in rice pudding, but the art of collective silence has faded. What's lost is more than a parlor game. The silent toast was a masterclass in communal storytelling, where every participant co-authored the evening's narrative through glances and suppressed laughter. In our age of constant noise and instant gratification, there's something profoundly radical about a celebration that asked revelers to find joy in anticipation, to savor the space between mystery and revelation. The candles may have guttered out, but the lesson lingers. Sometimes the sweetest celebrations aren't about what's said, but what's held breathlessly, deliciously unspoken. The slow vanishing of these medieval festivals wasn't the work of a single villain, but a perfect storm of forces reshaping society. First came the religious reformers, armed with scripture and suspicion, who saw these raucous celebrations as dangerous holdovers from pagan times. The Protestant Reformation in particular took aim at traditions like the Feast of Fools, branding them as sacrilegious theater. John Calvin's Geneva didn't just discourage such revelry, it criminalized dancing in the streets. Across Europe, Puritan leaders ordered maypoles chopped down and forbade Christmas pageants, viewing laughter itself as a distraction from sober devotion. Yet even the Catholic Counter-Reformation, though more tolerant of festivity, scrubbed away the wildest elements. The church that once winked at donkeys in cathedrals now demanded decorum, trading chaotic joy for carefully scripted processions. Industrialization delivered another blow, severing the connection between people and the agricultural rhythms that birthed these traditions. When factories replaced farms, the communal urgency of blessing plows or dancing for rain made little sense to workers trapped under smokestacks. Urbanization scattered tight-knit villages into anonymous city streets, where neighbors no longer shared the same harvest fears or seasonal milestones. The sheep-shearing feast lost its meaning when wool came from mechanized mills rather than hands that knew each sheep by name. Time itself became standardized, punched clocks replacing the fluid markers of solstice and seed time, leaving no room for festivals that once bent the calendar to nature's will. Perhaps the deepest loss was the shift from communal to individual celebration. Medieval festivals had no audience, only participants. Every villager, from lord to laborer, played a role in the pageantry. Compare that to modern holidays, where we often consume rather than create, watching fireworks displays designed by professionals, or attending concerts where performers and spectators remain strictly divided. The mock mayor elections once let everyone laugh at power together. Now we chuckle at political satire alone on our screens. Even Christmas, once a 12-day communal upheaval, has narrowed into private family gatherings, its wilder roots tamed by consumerism. Yet these traditions proved harder to kill than reformers and industrialists imagined. Some festivals didn't disappear, they shape-shifted. The roaring bonfires of St. John's Eve live on in backyard fire pits and beachside solstice parties. The Lord of Misrule's rebellious spirit fuels modern protest movements that use satire to challenge authority. And in quiet corners of Europe, from the flower-crowned dancers of Helston to the antlered men of Abbot's Bromley, fragments of these rituals endure, passed down like secret recipes. Their survival hints at a truth we're only now relearning. That shared celebration isn't just entertainment, but the glue that binds strangers into communities. The factories and cities that scattered medieval villages couldn't erase the human need to mark time together, to laugh in the face of hardship, and to occasionally crown a fool, light a fire, or chase a wheel of cheese downhill, just because joy, too, deserves its